Good evening, everybody. This is Cinnamon Noir. And welcome to Castlevania Circle of the Moon. I know that I said in the Aria of Sorrow Let's Play that I probably wouldn't be doing any more Castlevania games, but I lied, so here we are. This is the first of the GBA Metroidvanias, and a very interesting game that does things kind of bizarrely. For some reason I let the opening title go on to the Attract mode, which is kind of a funny thing this game has, not being an arcade game. But yeah. I mistakenly thought that I would cut off the music if I went to the title select, the file select, but actually it carries on into the file select. This voice you're hearing singing is actually singing the Kyrie Eleison, which is the first part of the ordinary Mass in Catholic liturgy, and the only part of the Mass, as far as I can tell, that's in Greek. Kyrie Eleison literally means, Lord have mercy, like a blues song. So this game is set in 1830, which is much more of, I'd say, a proper, like, Dracula kind of time period than a lot of the other ones we've seen recently. And unusually it takes place not at Dracula's castle, but in a castle in Austria, where his worshippers are attempting to bring him back. Successfully, as we'll soon see. Otherwise there wouldn't be much of a game. But it is funny how many Castlevania games actually do not take place in Dracula's castle, per se. I think it's at least half of them. Either not taking place in a castle at all, or not taking place in Dracula's specifically. So here we have Camilla, who is basically the leader of Dracula's worshippers. She's based on the character Carmilla from the novel of the same name from the 19th century, one of the earliest vampire works of fiction, actually. And again, so there can be a game, Dracula's not at his full power yet. And he's interrupted by our vampire hunters, 3 of them in this case, including one who sealed him the last time, which was about 50 years ago. So yeah, he's an old man now, and Dracula just completely burns him. And says something that's a little strange, that he's going to use his rival to return to power. Lord knows what he has in mind for Master Morris, but he sends the 2 of us away and falling down this very long pit. Presumably, it'll be hard for us to get back up to where he is, but we'll do our best. So there are 2 main characters in this game, more or less, Nathan and Hugh. Hugh is the son of Master Morris, and Nathan is basically just his star pupil. Kind of more favored, actually, than Hugh is, which is going to end up being a major plot point. So this is our protagonist, Nathan. I actually like him a lot, even though he has like a fairly simple walk cycle and he's kind of a more just standard fighter-type character. There's not a lot of special stuff about him, his personality. I do think he has kind of a stylish way about him. I also like the way he swings his whip. Actually, that little circular swirl that he has is much more useful than the typical dangly, jangly whip thing that most Belmonts have. Also interesting that there are no Belmonts in this story. You have Hugh and Morris Baldwin, who are just sort of related to them. And then Nathan, who doesn't really have any basic connection to the Belmonts at all. But he does have the Hunter Whip, which is like a not-quite vampire killer, which I suppose is somewhat effective against the undead? It's a little hard to say. The plot in this game is a little confusing and is not particularly... it's not told in a particularly detailed way within the game itself. You kind of have to rely on the manual and other things like that. These are pretty easy enemies. You can take them out in one hit. One interesting thing about this game is it's kind of hyper-lethal, like Spelunky, rather than something like Aria of Sorrow. Enemies early on do a lot of damage, or at least some of them do, but you also do a lot of damage to them. And things quickly ramp up, so that there's always this kind of tension between how strong you are and how strong the enemies are. The game is always introducing new enemies who just hit like a truck. And so you never really can relax in this game, except when you're backtracking through an area that you already know really well. Another thing this game does, which we'll see in later episodes, is it actually does replace enemies with harder ones at some point, to keep you on your toes, which I think is pretty clever. I always liked when Resident Evil did that. Another thing I should probably say at this point. Oh, well, maybe first I should talk about the upgrades that we're seeing here, for people who aren't familiar with this game. So we just got an HP max and a heart max. These are pretty self-explanatory. The heart max has increased the number of hearts you can have, which lets you use more sub-weapons. The HP ups and MP ups just increase those bars. HP ups, I would say, are the most important in this game. For most of the spells you're able to use with the DSS system, you don't use up much magic when using them, and so magic ups are not that important. However, once you get a combination you really like, you might find yourself using it so much that you use it up, and so at that point having more magic is pretty useful. Another reason I don't worry much or sweat much about losing magic is that magic restoring pickups are actually one of the most common in this game. They're more common than health restores, which is very strange. We also get to see here the knife in action. In Castlevania tradition, the knife freaking sucks. It's terrible. The only real benefit that it has is that it's cheap in terms of hard cost. I think each knife costs just 1. But we're going to find much better sub-weapons in this game. In fact, the sub-weapons in this game, in my opinion, are pretty unbalanced, especially since there are a lot of hard-ups. There's really not much benefit to having a cheap sub-weapon. Instead, you want the stronger ones that are more expensive. And as I mentioned in my comparison of the scariness of various Castlevania games, I don't really think of these upgrades as being that optional. They are technically optional, but if you don't get them, things get really difficult for you. Oh, you might also notice here our little friend the mouse cursor. That was an artifact of my recording software. I normally remember to unclick the little thing that says record the mouse cursor. In this case, I forgot, so we will be seeing him pop up from time to time. Hopefully it's not too distracting, because it's not there for very long. Even when I thought I wasn't recording it, I don't like to keep my cursor there, because obviously it gets in the way of me seeing stuff. It is kind of funny to me how I enjoy replaying Harmony of Dissonance more than this, but a lot of that is just because Harmony of Dissonance is easier. This game has its own kind of charms, and it is a very strange game. I really do think it captures the feel of an older Castlevania game better than the other Metroidvanias, even Order of Ecclesia, which was intended to do that. Which I just find kind of funny. Earlier I said that this game has graphics comparable to a Game Boy Color game. That was pretty unfair, actually. It has graphics comparable to an early Game Boy Advance game, which is what it is. There are some areas that look quite nice, but I will say in general, the graphics are pretty simple, and more oriented, I'd say, towards setting a mood than looking like a real place. However, in terms of atmosphere, the game actually does a pretty good job. Speaking of which, here we come to the first boss. If the first area, the Catacombs, did not convince you that this is a different kind of Castlevania game and one where you're going to have to be more careful, this boss will definitely do it. Circle of the Moon has almost an insane amount of boss difficulty. Not so much that you can't win against these bosses if you're a novice, but that they'll punish you so much, and they have so many varied attacks that are hard to figure out. So for instance, this is Cerberus. You know, it's a wolf, it's a beast, and yet a lot of its attacks could be described as spells. Like, it's able to summon those little electrical balls that cover the whole room and sweep back and forth, which is kind of strange. A lot of enemies in this game, I should say, a lot of bosses in this game, have attacks that don't necessarily seem to fit with their appearance, and which are surprisingly hard to dodge. So, you know, in this room, for instance, the structure of this room makes it kind of difficult to fight Cerberus. He's a big boss, he takes up a ton of the room, and his movements are kind of erratic. You know, he can do that sudden pounce forward. There's a tell for that, but it's hard to read. And he also moves so fast. He'll also do this move, which I absolutely hate. It's my most hated move of all of his, where he'll jump to one side of the room, and then just sweep the entire room with this laser that does massive amount of damage for this early in the game. The other thing is that I think his tell for the leap forward is very similar to a lot of his other tells, so it convinces me to run away from him when I really should be wailing on him with damage. And you can see here, he just moves crazy fast. I mean, it's ludicrous. Not to mention the fact that you can't really jump away from that attack that he does, the laser beam, by going away from him. You have to sort of jump into him and then hope you land on a higher platform. I hope you can kind of see what I'm getting at. This is really hard for a first boss. It doesn't ease you into the idea of fighting bosses at all. In fact, this is just, you know, it's a kind of tough, like, mid-level boss in any other Metroidvania game. What are you waiting around for, Nathan? Oh, I know, you're waiting for that orb to show up that heals your HP and MP. Well, guess what? In this game, there's no orbs. They don't show up. One interesting thing you might have noticed there is there's a pretty prominent hole in the map around the area where we fell. When you find areas like that in the game, it is quite common that there will be a secret room, usually containing some kind of power-up. In fact, almost invariably containing a power-up. and often harder enemies. So this axe armor, who we still have trouble dealing with, although with the holy water it's easier, he is guarding an MP up. This game, you know, I've never liked that idea that you have to bomb every inch of the floor in Metroid or anything like that, but this game I think actually comes the closest to the concept of you have to test every wall in order to find all the secrets. I don't know if I'd say that's good or bad. It appeals to different people. So like Donkey Kong Country, for instance, is a great example of a game where the secrets are really, like, hidden, and you have to work like crazy in order to find them. But that's sort of the point, is games are supposed to reward, you know, the interest of the player. So, you know, who can say if that's actually a good or a bad thing? Lots of people love Donkey Kong Country precisely for the reason that it has all those secrets. There is a box. Pushing that box is actually one of the upgrades we'll get, and we will not be getting it for a long time. Longer, oddly, than we'll be waiting to be able to destroy those cracked blocks, which is funny, because the cracked blocks look a lot heavier than those boxes. That just looks like a normal wooden box. You would think a guy who's as physically fit as Nathan could just push it ordinarily. He wouldn't need some magical amulet to do so. But, you know, it's one of the funny things about this game. Your character will be able to leap off of walls and, you know, destroy boulders before they're able to move a box around. Metroidvanias often have quirks like that. I will say, in terms of the upgrades you get in this game, this is one of the quirkier Metroidvanias I've played. So, lots of Metroidvanias, you'll get the double jump somewhere between a third and a halfway through. Dashing is often something that's fairly early, but not the first thing you get in the game. The idea of being able to dash and double jump, when we've really only played about 10 to 15% of the game so far, maybe even less than that, is pretty unusual. And it's one of the things that makes this game special. This game, oddly enough, like visually and audially, I suppose, it's not that distinct from other Metroidvanias, but in terms of its structure, this game's actually very distinct from other Metroidvanias. And by that I mean other games in the Castlevania series, as well as just the genre generally. But like I said in the video about, you know, the scariness of Castlevania, each one of the 6 games that I covered in that video has its own kind of appeal. And I really do think that none of them is a bad game. You know, if anything, this might actually be the worst of the lot just because it's so hard that limits its appeal. But it's that same difficulty that actually gives it an appeal the other Castlevania games don't have. It makes it special. I honestly think that if you like the older Castlevania games with their, you know, insistence on getting good at the combat mechanics and relative lack of cheap, like, cheesing options, I do think that you'll probably enjoy this even if you don't enjoy the other Metroidvanias, because it's just so much like that. You know, this is also a game where you can't just use potions and stuff to cheese boss encounters, because you don't get them. The game doesn't let you buy them, and you would have to probably spend 4 or 5 hours farming skeletons, at least if you don't have the luck boost, which I'll show off a little later. But you'd probably have to spend 4 or 5 hours in order to get enough potions to even heal your bar, like, a couple of times, which would be the equivalent of a full Estus flask in Dark Souls, and you get that for free. You don't have to do any grinding at all. Am I saying that this game is harder than Dark Souls? Yes. No, not really. So the second boss, the Necromancer, oddly enough, has more lines than almost anyone else in this game. He may actually have more lines than Camilla, which is weird. This is a character that is not introduced at the beginning. Like, God knows who he actually is, and yet he's like the puppet master. He's like, yes, let me tell you exactly what our evil plan is, down to the smallest detail. He is also a pretty difficult boss fight. In what will soon become a tradition with this game, pretty much every boss fight is difficult, and everyone manages to get me down to a sliver of health. So the least frustrating thing this guy does, it's really just more of a distraction than anything else, is he'll send out a bunch of beams that will summon various enemies into the room. And you'll have to deal with them, right? You can run into them and they'll do damage. One thing about it, though, is there's really not much to worry about with these enemies, because he can only summon zombies and skeletons. They do about 1 damage by bumping into you, meaning that the worst that can happen is temporary irritation. Whereas his attacks do like 20 to 30 damage each. I guess in this case it's 14. Not that much, but it's still a lot more than 1. So if you can dodge a single one of these circular things, that means more than running into a whole room full of skeletons. So why would you worry too much about this aspect of his attacks? So I defeated him here, and forgot that he had a second phase, which temporarily really threw me. Like, and I think you can see why, right? Who would remember that this boss has 2 phases? It's the second boss in the game, for Christ's sake. Oh, he also has this move in his second phase, which I really hate. Literally just randomly flies across the room. He's completely invulnerable during this phase. The thing this boss does that I really hate and that I consider very cheap is just how often this guy is not vulnerable to damage. The thing with him is not so much that he's like really hard or that his attacks do so much, but more just that he spends so much time just cheaply... Like, look at this. He's off the frickin' screen. Why is he even able to go there? I don't think that's fair. A lot of enemies in this game can do that, and it just kind of feels like you're cheating. Like, the game is cheating in the boss's favor. It often feels that way. It's just a very strange situation to be put in. I do manage to defeat him with more health left than I had with Cerberus. But, you know, part of that is because I had a potion in this fight. You may have noticed, though, when I use the potion, it's 20 HP. It means almost nothing. This opening area also looks a lot like the entrance to the castle as shown in Symphony of the Night. But that's probably a tradition that goes back before Symphony of the Night. Much more important than the aesthetics of this room is the cross. There are, I think, a few other cross sub-weapon areas in this game where you can get it, but this is the most easily accessible one, and you can get to it really early on. So, the cross is the best sub-weapon in this game. Once you get it, there is really no reason to have anything else. I foolishly get rid of it in a little while, but I shouldn't have done that. If I was smart, I would have kept it. I struggle to think of a single boss that the cross is not good against. And even though it's probably the most expensive sub-weapon, it costs 5 hearts each time you throw it, it is so worth it. You know, don't worry about the expense, especially since you may already have noticed, getting heart-restoring items is actually a lot easier in this game than getting health-restoring items. Another one of those weird quirks. I also find here a miracle armband, which increases your luck, but nothing else. Naturally, I put it on because luck is very important to me. We'll see that pretty soon. I go for kind of a high luck build in this run. Maybe not the smartest idea, especially when I'm not that great at the combat, but to me, more luck means more critical hits, and more of a possibility of getting those potions where if I got 10 of them I could maybe squeeze a reasonable health pickup out of them. The Machine Tower. Basically the same as the Clock Tower in other games. You can even tell from the gears that this is a Clock Tower. Why they don't call it a Clock Tower, I don't know. But one great thing that this place has is the Fox Archers, which are very clearly references to the Disney movie Robin Hood from 1973. I mentioned in one of my videos that, you know, there was a character from medieval fantasy who was a fox. He was called Reynard. And so, you know, maybe it wasn't from Robin Hood, but of course, Reynard was not portrayed as an archer, whereas Robin Hood obviously is one. And these enemies are fox archers, which means they're exactly the same as Disney's Robin Hood. The parallel's almost inescapable. I mean, this is a Disney reference. Which is so goofy in this game. Part of the reason I think I was reluctant to accept it is because it's such a goofy reference for a game that is otherwise so brutal and down-to-earth, like not particularly whimsical. But there is whimsy in this game. It's just, it comes in little bursts. You have to appreciate it when it comes. The whole Machine Tower is kind of a whimsical area. You have these brightly colored platforms that look kind of like the screw platforms from Sonic. I actually really love this area. The music is not so good, but the area itself is kind of fun. It's this weird combination of fun and frustrating. So, the thing about the Machine Tower that distinguishes it from previous areas is the rooms are really tall, and there's lots of moving platforms where you have to go back and forth on them, and sometimes you just have to start dashing and run around and take a leap of faith. Oh boy, and I lose the cross. Not fun. Yeah, so this time I go back and get it. The second time, I believe I just let it drop, which was one of the worst mistakes I ever made. The cross is actually really useful against the boss in this area, and when I don't have it against the boss, you know, I cried a little inside. But the thing about this area is because the rooms are so big, you can lose a lot of progress just by being hit once. This is an area that definitely tests your mobility, you know, how much have you learned about how to get around. Because you'll need to do it very quickly and without making mistakes in this area because of the Medusa heads. Another thing this area definitely tests you on is, have you learned the proper use of that whip spinning technique? Because this is one thing that can keep away the Medusa heads. The saving grace of the Medusa heads is they have very low health. So even though they're constantly spawning and getting in your way, if you can hit them once with the little thing, you know, you can protect yourself against them. So by using the circular spin, you can keep them away from you permanently. It's just a question of, are you able to hold down the attack button at that point, and do you have the presence of mind to do it? Do you also have the presence of mind to stop doing it when you... Presence of mind, yeah, that's what I did not have in this particular area. I pretty much figured that by the time I escaped from that stone, that the cross was probably already a forlorn hope. Like, I wasn't going to be able to get down there in time, it was going to despawn. And then I would have also lost all the progress, so I decided not to go back and get the cross. Bad idea. Or who knows, maybe the really bad idea was just getting hit in the first place. You know, I don't know why I decided to do that. Which, by the way, I do like the idea. So, at the very beginning of this game, right, we fell down this, giant pit with Hugh. And Hugh basically said, "Get out of here, Nathan. Nobody likes you. We don't need your friggin' help. I'll rescue Master on my own." Even though he's a total chump and he doesn't rescue crap. But, I love the fact that while Hugh is going around the castle trying to do just various things to rescue Mr. Morris, Nathan is going up like this quirky machine tower with all these guys, having a grand old time, like playing with toys. And then eventually fighting a golem. I'll just spoil that. That's the boss for this area. It's like, this whole area is kind of silly. The idea that Nathan is doing this is all done in a single night, by the way. Because this is all the night in which Dracula's being revived. Their plan is to, at midnight, I believe, or something having to do with the moon. Like, there's some time element to this game. And eventually, after like several hours pass, Morris will be sacrificed, and Dracula will be fully revived. So we need to stop that from happening. And so there's relatively little time to do this. Hugh somehow doesn't get any power-ups, and yet he goes through the whole castle. And meanwhile, Nathan's just goofing around, finding power-ups, having a grand old time. It's just kind of... So here we have the Iron Golem. In terms of dodging his attacks, this is the easiest one in the game. Like, you can hit those gears that he drops from the roof. And so if you do, like, this guy's kind of a chump. He can't do much to you. His attacks are no great shakes. Like, that is his worst attack, definitely. The one where he punches and then sends out all those little explosions. But that is not actually very hard to dodge. You can just run away from him, and that'll work. One thing I forgot here is that those gears do stay on screen a little bit longer after you hit them. If anything, I would say the difficult thing about this guy is that he can kind of get you into a corner, and he is tall enough that it is a little bit difficult to jump over him. So learning how to jump over him successfully can be a bit frustrating. Another frustrating thing is he can just heal himself. I do have a thing against enemies in this game that have the ability to heal themselves. It's often kind of arbitrary, and I don't understand why they're able to do it. But oh well. Axes aren't the best against this guy because he just stays earthbound, and so something that can sort of stick in one area and hit him is a lot better. But, you can obviously see in terms of the way he's moving around, this guy is so much easier than the previous bosses. Like, it's ridiculous. This guy probably should have been the first boss in the game. Even with his ability to heal, he is nowhere near being as difficult to handle as, like, the Cerberus. The one thing about him is that one particular attack hits like a truck, but it's so easy to dodge. I mean, maybe I shouldn't be saying that because I've been hit by it 3 times now. But I'm really doing a terrible job against this guy. Like, don't take this as a normal fight against this guy. I remember even playing this game for the first time. This guy seemed like a complete waste of space to me. Like, I toyed with this guy. And even then, see, like, I probably could have taken another hit. Which I don't think was true for, like, the Cerberus or the Necromancer. Oh, hey, Hugh. How's it going? No, I'm trying to help your dad, you selfish asshole. Going to the Eternal Corridor, which kind of sounds like bad news if you think about what that means for the structure of this area. It is, as the name would suggest, just a bunch of really long hallways. So you'd think this area is maybe a little uncreative. I see it more as being kind of like Alraunes' quarters from the Symphony of the Night, where the appeal of this area is not at all in the structure of it or in any gimmicks. It's just in the types of enemies you fight. There are some really fun enemies here. The Gorgons I do not consider a particularly fun enemy. They're just, damage sponges who can take a lot of hits, and also, they're not that interesting to fight because they don't do anything that directly damages you. You actually have to run into them to take damage. All they do is spit out that little, petrifying breath, which is really easy to avoid. So in this room, the only reason that this is annoying at all is because of the ectoplasms, who again do a surprising amount of damage considering how many of them there are. But they're mostly an annoyance. We have skeleton knights here, just like the earlier skeleton soldiers. They're a little more than a nuisance. Much more deadly is this Flame Demon, who I actually consider one of the least balanced enemies in the game, considering, the level you're at when you fight him. Like, this attack in particular is a little ridiculous. I suppose you have to slide under that in order to dodge it. But because he alternates between these two attacks a lot, it is a little difficult to get the rhythm of them right away. Yeah, there we go. I suppose also you could probably use the whip to destroy them, which if I had more presence of mind I would have done. Instead, however, he took me to town. And, yeah. So I'm gonna turn chicken and run away for now. This is the time to get some more upgrades. This is gonna happen a lot in this game, so buckle in for that. And go into this next room, which is a very silly room. So in this room we have a bunch of skeleton athletes. All they do is run at you. They don't even, slide or try to hit you or anything. They just run full pelt into you. It's like they're kamikaze bombers, which is kind of crazy. Another funny thing you might notice here in a second is that when you actually get hit and they don't die immediately, which is what usually happens, they sort of skid around as if they didn't expect to go through you. Speaking of swords, one interesting enemy in the chapel tower proper are these floating swords, who are, again, kind of a nuisance enemy like the ectoplasms, but the way they move around is actually pretty interesting. They will spin around in place until they stop in one area, like a little Wheel of Fortune kind of thing. And then they will move in that direction, usually toward you, and then spin around again, and then repeat. What's interesting about them is often they don't hit you directly. They will end up just in your vicinity. So sort of just something you have to think about, less so than something that's actively trying to hunt you. I have to say, in terms of both aesthetics and the enemy placement here, I really love the Chapel Tower. This is one of my favorite levels in Circle of the Moon. Honestly, possibly one of my favorite levels in the GBA Metroidvanias, period. The bloody swords you'd think would be really annoying, but I don't know, something about the way they designed their movement, they're actually just more fun to fight. I think a big part of it is they don't do that much damage. So, it doesn't come across as really frustrating when they hit you because you can deal with it. Different from most enemies in this game. I guess another thing about it would just be that they don't cause you to flinch or knock back when they hit you, which so many enemies in this game do that it's kind of a welcome respite to have an enemy that just does damage. And again, that stained glass in the background, I have to say, it's not that it's that pretty, but I appreciate the level of detail they put into it. When you consider that, these are such primitive graphics that it's hard to make something that legitimately looks like stained glass. They really tried, though. It's not quite up to the level of the stained glass in Harmony of Dissonance, but again, that's true for all of the graphics in this game. And the stained glass is probably closer, in terms of the quality to that, than a lot of the other, aesthetic aspects of this game. I think one reason I really like the stained glass in this room is that there's so many different types of stained glass. They didn't just use one big design. Instead, there's tons of these little panels that have all these weird geometric designs and, sort of attempts, very low res, less than 8-bit attempts at portraying scenes. It's very cluttered, which I like because, the cluttered kind of ornamental Baroque look is really how a lot of Catholic iconography works. There is sort of a horror of empty space, it's literally called horror vacui, that is characteristic of Catholic art. And this game kind of gets that. But not an easy boss, as we'll soon see. Ooh. Well, smell you later. Yeah, so we are going to fight the boss here. Adramelech. I love the name of this boss. He shares his name with one of the evil, demon characters from Final Fantasy Tactics, who's based on, I think... Adramelech is one of the characters from the Infernal Dictionary, or the Lesser Key of Solomon, which is one of these famous works of demon summoning. And he's based, I think, on Baphomet, who was this fictional god that basically the Catholic Church invented to say that he was what Freemasons worshipped. He's a goat-headed god. And so basically this was just propaganda. They came up with the idea of this god in order to discredit the Freemasons. Anyway, Adramelech is probably one of the least satisfying bosses in the entire game. Not only does he hit really hard and have this room just full of these obnoxious, spells that he summons, but also you can only hit him by jumping up. So, he doesn't move at all. So he's not satisfying to track or anything like that. His attacks are boring. Like, just a very frustrating boss overall. I don't see much of the point of this guy. I think they could have made a boss with a similar appearance who would move around and be more interesting. But they were really enamored with the idea of this guy just being stuck and locked up in the cathedral tower. I don't know. And then when he dies, he has that really creepy neck wound. Yeah, I don't like anything about this guy. And here's our upgrade. An MP up? That's weird. So no, the actual reward for this is that switch, which has now broken all of those Iron Maiden-like switches all over. An unsatisfying upgrade for an unsatisfying boss. Dude, you were dying. Oh, don't worry about this for a second. My computer hiccuped. Hugh, whips don't kill people. Vampire killers kill people. Well, vampires, technically. It's nice to see you too, Hugh. What a good friend. So, in the last episode, we got to the top of the chapel tower, and pressed a switch that blew up a bunch of Iron Maidens, which, you have to admit is pretty metal. If a bit unsatisfying from a mechanical perspective, I would much rather have a mobility upgrade. But actually, one interesting thing about this game is that because the upgrade path is so skewed, it makes it a little difficult in the later parts of the game for them to give you satisfying upgrades. When you start out with first giving them the dash and then double jump right off the bat, like, at that point you've already gotten most of the things that make a game fun to move around with. So it was kind of hard for them to invent new stuff. Like, at this point, the one upgrade left, I would say, that really makes you feel like moving around feels different would be just the ability to fly, what's normally called the Griffin Wing or the Gravity Jump. But they can't give that to you now. I mean, that's an endgame power-up. So instead we have all these weird parts of the middle of the game where they give you powers like pushing boxes around, or just, let's blow up a few statues that were standing in the way. And it's interesting, this desire to make the beginning of the game more interesting can sometimes make the middle sag more. You would think, well, why don't they just come up with more good ideas? But it really is sometimes a case of just, there's a certain fixed number of things you can come up with to make a game more interesting, and if you use too many of them too soon, it can make the later parts of the game less interesting. One thing that is definitely going to make the Chapel Tower return more interesting is they have replaced most of the Flame Knights with, or is it called Flame Armor? With these electricity-based ones, who are more difficult, and also their attacks much more annoying to try to avoid. This is probably the quickest that an enemy has ever been replaced with another type of enemy in the same area. Oh no, do I leave the cross behind here? Oh, I'm an idiot, I do. Oh look, the gold armor. Could have used that 30 minutes ago. By the way, I have to say, in addition to the stained glass, one thing I like about this area, and now that I look at it again, the save rooms too, is the carving. There's some really fun little carvings in the stonework of this game that make it feel a little more realistic and help enhance that sense that it's three-dimensional, since the carvings are in the foreground and your character's moving around in kind of the middle ground. And then, of course, you have the room in the background. I love with these stained glass windows, especially in this room in particular, how they're so tiny that it's almost impossible to make out what they actually show. Like, I think there's supposed to be some saints, maybe a biblical scene at the bottom there, and the top is clearly some sort of palace, but it almost looks like a Chinese palace, because it's so compressed. And as for the border, I couldn't tell you what that is. Maybe a garland of flowers or something? We get more gold armor, which would be really useful if this game had shops, but it doesn't, so it's not. And here we go into probably my most hated area in this game, the underground gallery. You'll see soon why, but for now, just rest assured, there is nothing fun about this area. Except for the music. As is typical for this game, the music is fantastic. This is Aquarius, which is a very well-known musical track from Castlevania 3 that's been reused in a lot of Castlevania games, but I think this was the first one to reuse it. So we find our first save room here, out of 2, and deal with the Spectres, which is the third version of what was originally the Spirits and the Ectoplasms. These Spectres are obnoxious. You'd think, well, they'd be exactly the same as the other ones, right? But actually, the Spectres are made to spawn in such a way in these really tall rooms that they almost always manage to knock you out of your upward trajectory. And that just makes them so irritating. I hate these specters. Just one thing of many that makes me hate this area. Another one is that these king moths, along with a lot of other enemies in this area, inflict poison. Poison is one of the most common things that will happen to you in this area. In fact, you get poisoned almost about as much as you get hit in this level. The other thing I don't like about it, and this is a flaw that's common to a lot of parts of Circle of the Moon, is that most of this area is just series of long hallways. Like, it's just hallway after hallway. The difficulty is mostly in just dealing with all these enemies, some of which are damage sponges, and some of which are just obnoxious punks. But actually, now that we have this, now that we have, funnily enough, a soul, or a card of something that is like a chicken, we are going to turn chicken, and we are leaving this horrible place. I just finish him off. And we're falling down this pit again. I'm getting really used to the sight of this pit. Oh, I also decided here to check out the other entrance to the underground waterway. The thing about this is, in the other direction we couldn't go anywhere because there was an impediment. Here, the water is poisonous. We will actually eventually get an ability that will clear the water. However, until that happens, you will basically die going in there. There are speedruns that have involved going to that area. You have to move very carefully and very cleverly in order to get that. So I wouldn't recommend it for a novice. And since I am a novice, I wouldn't recommend it for me, so I won't be doing it. Yeah, that room in particular I hate. I cannot stand that room. And here's another terrible room. So this is almost exactly the same as the last room, except rather than having the evil hands, they just have more man-eaters. I do like the man-eaters as enemies, but it's not enough to make up for the rest of this area. This is just a terrible area. And honestly, you know, I know I'm being very subjective here, but I do think objectively this is actually a pretty bad area. I'm so demoralized by it that I barely even remember to go back and get the holy water. Not that holy water is any good against the next boss, so I'm going to have to find another sub-weapon. Preferably the cross, but I don't know if there is a cross in this area or how to get it. But one thing about that is that in that case, sometimes you realize just how little there is to notice. Oh god, I hate that specter. Even with my little protective thing here, like, this is still so frustrating. In this room in particular, these specters spawn in such a way that it's just evil. Like, the game knows exactly where you want to go, and that is where they spawn. So I decided to go here with the defense boost. Probably sensible, because this boss hits pretty hard. Or should I say bosses? Because this is in fact 2 bosses. And once I hit them, we'll see what they're called. Yeah, the Dragon Zombie. Should be called Dragon Zombies, really. These guys are awful. So, the only vulnerable part in them is the head. And their heads move around very erratically. Which, of course, not only means, since their heads cause damage and spit out lots of, breath attacks, it not only means they can hit you out of nowhere, and it's almost... I shouldn't say almost impossible. Very difficult to predict, where their head is going to be at any given time. But also, there's all these platforms in this room. But you'll notice, basically, only 2 of them are any good. Being on the floor so you can hit them from below with a sub-weapon like the axe, or being on this one particular platform so that you can hit them with your whip. All of the other platforms are basically just an area where you can get hit by them and you can't hit them back. They're actually remarkably close to the ground considering how tall this room is. So, you're encouraged to just either stay on the floor or on that one platform. Why are these other platforms here? It doesn't make much sense. The other thing that I find really irritating is that their necks can damage you, but cannot be damaged by you. Which to me is just kind of unfair, like that's very cheap. When you combine that with how erratically they move, the fact is, when their head is moving erratically, that is the same thing as their neck's moving erratically, and the neck can just hit you for so much damage. You'll be trying to avoid their breath attacks by, going back and forth, but that will cause you to be smacked by the neck as their head swings around again. It's actually kind of bizarre how fast they can move their heads, given that these are giant, slow-looking enemies. But really, the hardest thing with these guys is just being able to hit them. They move their heads out of attack range so much. So yeah, really, just kind of a cheap, annoying boss, which is the perfect way to cap off a cheap, annoying level. I have so much trouble with these guys. Admittedly, I have kind of a bad sub-weapon. I'm sloppy because I've forgotten all these guys' patterns. But the thing about these guys is their patterns aren't even particularly easy to remember. Yeah, I don't like this boss. Like, you could say I'm not good at this game, and maybe I need to find a way to do this better. But it still wouldn't make me like this boss. Even if I could beat this boss in 2 minutes, I would still think it's boring and just not very fun. Considering that the last boss, Adramelech, was one that also hits ridiculously hard, and is just not that interesting. It's a really bad 1-2 combo of bosses. One thing you do have to be aware of, though, is that once one of them is dead, the other one will heal himself by eating the dead one, which is so frickin' gross. Like, this enemy really has no redeeming qualities. It's not honorable, you know, it's not fun, it's just gross and obnoxious. So there's his attack. Like I said, much easier to dodge. I also think once one of them is dead, there's a few combo attacks they can't do. I guess he can still pound the ground and send those rocks flying down. Which, kind of like what the Iron Golem did in the Machine Tower, that's your sign that you need to start spinning the whip so you can protect yourself against it. I don't know if there's any way to predict where those things are going to come down. The funny thing about this boss is that once you've killed one of the dragons, the boss fight is very close to being successfully finished, because the other one finds it so... because the other one is so restricted in where it can go. It's so much easier to dodge him. On the other hand, he will still just pull his head away, so that ridiculously, it's almost impossible for you to hit him. The fact that these bosses can do this, that they can do things like what the Necromancer does by going outside of the level, or just these guys going to where there are no platforms to attack them, it's just cheap. There's nothing fun about it. I do kind of wish that I had been a little more economical with the crosses in the first part of this battle, so that I could use some crosses against this guy once he was down to him. Because I really didn't get any cross hits on him at all. And if I had, I think we'd already be done with the boss fight by now. Here we go. Oh, I cannot tell you how freaking satisfying it is to beat this boss after you've died to it twice. I actually did die twice. I edited out one of them. But yeah, even without that orb, I'm feeling pretty good right now. I'm feeling like a vampire killer. So, is everybody hungry? Because I think it's chicken time. I run away, yet again. Yeah, we'll be getting to this place later, but for now I think we need to make some progress in the actual, like, mandatory part of the game. And a place that I actually completely forgot about the last time that I played this game, oddly enough. Yeah, so we're about to head into the pit again. No, I'm just kidding. I couldn't resist. No, this is the underground warehouse. You may have noticed earlier in that underground section we had the fox hunters, which was sort of a foretaste of this area, where there's lots of them. Just stronger versions of the fox archers. It's kind of funny how we go from the fox archers to the hyenas, which are like an iteration on them in both senses, to the fox hunters, which are literally just recolors of the fox archers. You think they could have gotten more creative, right? Like, how about a tiger holding a machine gun? You know? How about an elephant with a Mauser rifle? Incidentally, while I'm thinking about it, the enemy design in this game and stuff, in the last episode I complained to Koji Igarashi personally about the design of enemies in this game and how broken it is. I should not have done that, because it turns out, and for some reason I didn't think of this for the longest time, Koji Igarashi was not responsible for this game. His team, actually, the team that worked on Symphony Night, didn't even make this. This was made by a totally different internal Konami team who worked in Kobe, I think. And the Koji that you see sometimes in the credits for this game is actually a different guy named Koji. It's not Koji Igarashi, it's a guy named Koji Horie, I believe. So I'm very sorry, Iga, for tarnishing your your legacy inappropriately. It turns out Koji Igarashi didn't even like this game. He thought it was a mistake. Probably because it was so unbalanced and kind of broken, you know, against the player. Because I will say a lot of Iga's games, because Iga's well known for the Metroidvanias rather than the classic old-fashioned Castlevania games, a lot of his games are easier on the player. They're more lenient, and they make it easier for you to, you know, get through without being a super talented or skillful player. But actually, you know, looking back on this game, even though I love Iga and I think his approach overall is a little better, I kind of like the way that this game preserves that difficulty of the older Castlevanias. I think it did a much better job than Iga himself was able to do when he did Order of Ecclesia, mostly because Iga wanted to make a game that was, like, pleasant to play through, that it was, like, fun. And the thing about the older Castlevanias is they're actually not like that. I'm not saying they're not fun, but fun isn't what they're designed for. They're designed to be challenging. And so this game, with its willingness to not be fun and to screw you over, kind of contains a little more of that feel of, this game will push you around. While I was playing this, I have to say, one thing it reminded me a lot of, funnily enough, was the game Demon's Souls, which is 3D. It's sort of totally different in a lot of ways. But where these two games are similar is their willingness to do things that a balanced game theoretically wouldn't, and they're willing to be broken, essentially. But also the fact that, they're difficult, but they make you feel good when you get through the whole game. And so they have that sort of challenge, where by being so difficult, it really shows how much you've grown as a player when you actually manage to get through it. Another thing that this game shares in common with Demon's Souls, is that the final boss, oh thank God for that HP up, or perhaps I should say in Demon's Souls' case, the penultimate boss, but it's basically the final real boss, is so freaking difficult and broken. In the case of Demon's Souls, he can literally de-level you, which is just, that's out of bounds. That's something like a game should not do. But it does. And sometimes it's right for a game to do what you're not supposed to do. But anyway, both of these games are so difficult that at the end, the final boss, I was compelled to cheat. Kind of dispiriting, actually. Ooh. Could have used that 30 minutes ago. Right, so we're putting on the defense. And I'm using up my hard items because I don't want to grind for hearts. Yet. Let's just fight the next boss. And guess what? It is Death. Yes, Death himself. And funnily enough, even though Death is basically Dracula's right-hand man, his main servant, in this game, the Necromancer is the one that has this giant villain spiel, and Death says literally nothing, just starts attacking you. Pretty disappointing. Pretty far to fall for the, main man of Dracula. And I have to say also, this boss fight, kind of disappointing from the perspective of other Dracula fights. Dracula's normally supposed to be a highlight in Castlevania games. He certainly was in all of the, old school, linear kind of Castlevania games. But, I don't know, something about Konami, even after Iga took back over, from Symphony of the Night in 97, all the way through, I'd say, to probably Dawn of Sorrow. Well, no, it's Aria of Sorrow. Aria of Sorrow was a big comeback for Death, despite him still not getting any lines. Portrait of Ruin fixed that. But yeah, they just did weird things with Death. So in this first stage, kind of disappointing, he just has those little skeleton things he can shoot out. And he has the scythes, and he can summon orbs. But this second phase, which is deceptively difficult, especially when he does this move, which you might not notice, has actually increased my gravity, so now I can't jump or run away easily. And then that move, where he slams the ground, and if you are on the ground, he will do damage to you no matter where you are in the room. This stage of the fight is deceptively difficult. Since the scythes keep coming, all of these different weird attacks he can do, like spells, they're very surprisingly difficult. The other thing about Death, and this is why I hate this particular boss fight, I made a huge mistake and used up all of my sub-weapons in the first stage. Kind of dumb, because the first stage isn't that difficult, and you can get whip hits on him. In the second stage, Death's actual vulnerable part is like his shoulders or something. You can't hit any of the parts that are skeletal. I think it's only the fleshy ones that are hittable. Not only do you have to get within range of his sickle claw attack in order to hit him, but also you're close enough that, he can run into you when you're that close. So it's actually a really bad idea to be that close to him. I'm in a bad position here. Essentially, the only way I can damage him is to stand right up close to him and fire out the whip. The problem with that is, when I'm close to him, he'll sickle me like that, and it's really hard for me to run away with the scythes. So I keep getting scared away from the only position where I can do damage. I hate bosses that work like this, and there's a lot of them in this game. One reason why boss fights are a particular, low light for me in this game, among others. And in fact, I'm about to get killed here in the most embarrassing way possible. I get killed by the ground smash. But it is kind of becoming a tradition for me to be killed by Death. Let's try again. This is me after I've done a little bit of grinding to get some hearts back, and learning that I should save those crosses for the second stage, when I really need them. So like I said before, he can send out those little bone spurs, which are very strange. I don't know what he's doing to his skeletal body to make that happen. It's weird. A lot of Death's attacks seem more magical, like this one in particular. That little green orb attack is probably his hardest and most damaging attack in his first stage. Other than that, when you think about it, he's mostly just wandering around the room. But yeah, that bone spur thing, that doesn't look like a magical spell. That looks like him somehow deforming his body to attack you. Kind of gruesome, actually. One thing I do like about this area is these weird little paintings of biblical scenes in the background. At least I assume that's what they are. They're so low res, it's kind of hard to tell. I couldn't tell you what biblical stories they're illustrating, if any. But it kind of looks like there's people and demons flying around. Yeah, it is kind of weird in this room. It's awkwardly set up. So the two paintings, which are definitely the most interesting things visually in the room, are on either side of it. And then in the middle, there's just this huge empty space of, like, bookcases and a big skull with curtains coming out of it. Death definitely needs a new interior decorator. I would recommend Juiced from Harmony of Dissonance, because he has excellent furnishing sense. If I ever do a Let's Play of that, you'll definitely see that's on full display. Okay, so we finally get him into Phase 2. I'm going to put my defense on, because he is much more damaging in this phase. I have to say, in addition to not liking his attacks in this phase, like how cheap I think he is, I just don't like the appearance of this. He looks like some weird snail. Like, what the hell does this have to do with death? Definitely something that only, like, Japanese game designers would think of doing. Or, like, Junji Ito or something. His fleshy parts I also don't like. The fact that it suddenly goes from Death as a skeleton and you attack his skeleton to Death has meat parts and then skeleton and like bones coming out of them, and the bones you can't attack and the fleshy parts you can, doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And he dies as he lived, making absolutely no sense whatsoever. He gets sucked into a black hole. Is Death from another dimension? Is that why he's a snail? Like, it's really hard to tell. I get the feeling there's a really fascinating backstory behind a lot of this game that you never get told. Yeah, here we are at the bottom of the pit. I've become very accustomed to this place. So you can, of course, just go all the way back up through the underground warehouse to the Triumph hallway if you want. But I think this is what they intended, because it's faster, and also because they pull a kind of neat little trick that we're going to see in a moment, which it seems like they wanted to surprise you with. So when you go back into this room, you will see, now we have much harder enemies here, the Grizzlies from the last area, along with an enemy we haven't even seen before, Arachne, who, if I recall correctly, was not in Symphony of the Night, and so this might be an original enemy, but she shows up in a lot of later Igavanias as well. This is kind of a pulling the rug out from under you moment when this happens, you know? So you might think from them replacing the enemies in that one room, in the catacombs, that the catacombs are now full of these really difficult enemies. And like, if you wanted to get any upgrades from there, you should have gotten them before. That is not technically true. Actually, as far as I can tell, that's the only room in the catacombs where the enemies have been replaced. So they definitely wanted to surprise you, but not that much. Here we can see the effects of the cleansing tool that we obtained from Death. I hope you enjoyed that little cutscene, because that's the only time we're going to see it, ever. So this amulet's now totally useless. I'm going to be carrying around a lot of pointless jewelry by the end of this game. So here we run into that new enemy I was talking about, the Witch. I like the witches. I like how they're literally just basic Halloween witches that are flying around in this sewer. Kind of reminds me of like kitchen witches, or those witches that people show having run into a tree in their yards. Witches in funny situations, to me, is a classic, just Halloween thing. I also feel like, considering that in Symphony of the Night there was a lion enemy, a tin man, and a scarecrow, it's almost necessary for there to be just a witch, and not the witches that are in previous games, which are, you know, hot, but a classic Margaret Hamilton-style green-skinned warty witch. One very interesting, but not cheap type of enemy that I like in this area is the Lizard Man. We saw one of these guys before in that little bonus area in the underground warehouse. Sorry, the underground gallery. But I actually really like the Lizard Men. They kind of remind me of the Lizalfos from Zelda, especially in the sense that if you just attack them, then they'll just shield. You have to sort of catch them off guard. And you can do that by sort of running away and then leaping back at them. Or, another interesting way that I've showed against the first guy, but also against some of these guys, is if you do your little spinning whip thing, they'll eventually realize that they have an opening to attack you, so they'll drop their shield and try to attack, and that's when you have your opening to attack them. So you sort of outwit them. But it's actually a lot easier just to jump back and forth over them and then, destroy them slowly that way. It's not very honorable, but then again, who needs honor when you're fighting a lizard? We are very low on hearts, but I'm going to go ahead and risk it. Because, what's life if you don't take risks? Well, often if you do take risks, life is death, but, we can get by anyway. I'm not worried. I have no healing items, but it doesn't matter. This I was not expecting. Well, not the first time. I've played this game before, so I was expecting it. Oh, that sounds reasonable. I just love that line. You are delusional. This game's better written than Symphony of the Night, but it still sometimes comes up with corny lines. I also like Nathan's just, shut up! Oh no, you got Hugh. You turned him into an asshole. I mean, he was already an asshole, but now he's even more of an asshole. And she turns into something really weird. So kind of similar to what that one woman turns into on the clock tower. Like some weird hybrid of like a death skull and a naked woman. This is what Camilla turns into. I think the idea is she's supposed to be some kind of succubus, but it's really weird. Anyway, I do actually like this battle a lot. Camilla is one of the fairer boss enemies in the game, aside from that attack, which is kind of bullshit. But, unlike, Adramelech, who was also this giant boss who was in the middle of the room, Camilla's attacks don't just flood the whole room with, projectiles you can't dodge or get rid of. You can actually destroy these little purple orbs, which it's very helpful to do so because they last longer than you'd think. She's actually kind of a forerunner to some of Dracula's attacks, which is appropriate, because in this game she's like Dracula's main... I was going to say main squeeze. She's like Dracula's main follower. Now, anyway, her boss design is kind of weird, but I do really love the design of this room. It's really cool looking. I love all of the water pouring down the walls, and then there's weird statues where it's kind of hard to tell what they are. I think they're supposed to be women pouring out water from an urn. One thing I do not like about Camilla's boss design is the very H.R. Giger-like wires going up through that skull. It's very, bizarre and gothic, but also kind of contrived. Anyway, I've used up all my crosses here. And I'm actually playing okay. This is better than I normally play. But I'm gonna be honest, I did not expect to pull this one out. I'm already pretty low on health. And I wasn't sure how much health Camilla had. As it turns out, she doesn't have that much. But I've kind of assumed, being one of the head honchos of this Dracula, revival cult, that she was going to be, she was going to have a lot of health and be a major boss. I barely managed to put my defense back up, which I think saved my life. And yeah, I take care of her with just a sliver of health left. You go, Nathan. Huh. Apparently she was part red-tailed hawk. So now all I need to do is get back to the save point, and not, completely fail to take advantage of what just happened. This actually is kind of amazing. So these evil hands got me over and over again, but they attacked me so much that they actually gave me invincibility frames, so the lizardmen didn't attack me once. I am fairly certain if the lizardmen had gotten off a single attack, even with my defense up, I would have died. So this is as clutch gets. I claim no credit for this. Honestly, I think I have to give a hand to the evil hands. But here is an enemy against whom I definitely will not be impetuous. This is Lilith, one of two higher levels of the succubus. The other one is called a fallen angel and is even more difficult, I believe. But they have the same attacks, which is just, they're surrounded by these horrible little circular, spell things, these rings. And they can send them at you like crazy. You'll notice she already shaved off practically my entire health bar. That took 15 seconds. And this time, I'm a little better prepared. But I'm going to be honest, it doesn't make much of a difference. I am mostly here just to get that upgrade and get out. I don't know if I thought maybe I'd distract her and that would keep me alive for longer. Not necessarily true, especially when she can do that freaking cheap enemy thing that they do in this game, where they just hide off screen so you can't hit them. But given she's doing more than 100 health every attack, yeah, I'm not going to stick around to see what other tricks she has up her sleeve. What I am going to do is we're going to go in reverse up this pit. What a refreshing change of pace. It looks so different from this perspective. Ah, who am I kidding? It looks exactly the same. One annoying thing about the way that this game changes when you get the rock wing is that the game starts keeping in mind that you can fly anywhere you want, which means the enemies start to move a lot up and down. This is actually pretty annoying because the rock wing is not very easily controllable. When you use it, you just zoom up into the air. And so the result is the game sort of assumes you can fly, so why not have enemies that go all over the place? But flying is actually not as easy to use in combat as you would think. It's a bit awkward. The enemies, of course, are not awkward at all when they fly, because they've been flying their whole lives. But this is actually my favorite room in the game, I would say, just in terms of aesthetics. Even though it makes no sense that the moon would be this huge, because, like, it's weird. The moon is made to be bigger in rooms that you get to later, as if the night has, gone on longer, and so the moon's bigger because, it's kind of closer. I don't know what I'm talking about, but... yeah, the funny thing about that, though, is they don't change the size of the moon in previous rooms. So it looks more like the moon is just really big from some rooms in this castle, and tiny in others. Which I guess you could say is part of the castle's magic, but that's kind of retconning. Anyway, but I do just love the huge moon in the background here against the castle battlements. It's a really cool image. And there's some armor that I won't end up getting, because I can't get to that area before it will despawn. I have no idea what that is. I think it might have just been gold armor, that's what it looks like. Or possibly even bronze armor. If so, then I haven't missed out on much. But I'll never know, it's, a mystery. A tantalizing mystery that I'll never get to see. I really like this image of the moon. It's nice and craggy, it has the proper detail you'd expect. And, since this game is called Circle of the Moon, and there's a lot of talk about, the moon is full, when the moon sets, like, all this stuff will happen, it's good that they focus on the moon in the visual department. Because, it's a good symbol. The influence of the moon is also something that sort of psychologically is pretty cool when you consider what happens to our friend Hugh. He's driven mad by jealousy of Nathan, and by, being upset that his dad didn't trust him with the whip. And so it's like he goes a little mad, right? He has a problem with lunacy. Which literally is being under the influence of the moon. That's the reason why it's called that. So this is actually the room in which you can move on to this next final area. Pretty tough area, but also one of my favorites in the game. The Observation Tower. Basically the equivalent to the top floor or the master's floor in other parts of the game. Although, funnily enough, in a lot of areas that are this high up in Dracula's castle, in other games, you actually fight Dracula here. But here, Dracula's in the middle of the castle, kind of like Symphony of the Night, and you fight someone different here. You also fight these legions, who are actually pretty easy enemies. The main thing that's difficult about them is just getting up to where they are to do damage, and dealing with their kind of erratic movement. So they can kind of trick you. Their appearance is also really grotesque, kind of Junji Ito inspired. I've mentioned Junji Ito a lot in this, but I don't know, something about this game and its weird, kind of lo-fi aesthetic reminds me of his horror stories. Also the tentacles probably has something to do with it, and the skull motifs. I really don't know how influential Junji Ito was in Japan at this time. I know that a lot of his stories had been published by like the early 2000s when this game came out. But I think he didn't really hit international prominence until Uzumaki became famous in like the mid to late 2000s. I don't remember when it was written. I think it was written maybe 2003. But either way, it's entirely possible these guys have heard of Junji Ito. It's also possible that they just were coming up with grotesque enemy designs, and, it's sort of independent invention. Including an area that has some enemies that, as far as I can tell, appear nowhere else in the game. These are wind armors. Also, one of the easiest armor enemies in the game, because if you get outside of their attack range, they literally don't hit you. They have technically a projectile, but it doesn't move along the screen, so you can just get out of the range of it. The one thing that might trick you with these guys is their range is a little bigger than you might suspect. But yeah, overall, pretty easy enemies. I'm kind of surprised they bothered to put them in. They could have just put, like, holy armors here, which actually would have been pretty difficult to deal with in these cramped environments. So I was assuming that this was actually an alternate entrance to the observation tower, but I'd forgotten the observation tower is fairly linear, so this is actually a totally different part of the castle. It's just also very high up. It's interesting. The design of this castle, which of course is not one of Dracula's castles, it's just some castle in Austria that Camilla decided to take over to bring him back towards, is there's the main area, you know, on the ground floor. There's a lot of underground areas, and then there's basically 3 different towers. So on the left-hand side, you have the machine tower, which you explore first. On the right-hand side, the chapel tower. And, you know, those have very different functions and very different styles, and they're also very different from the whole rest of the game. Oh, by the way, we do find another warp room here. So it turns out I was wrong about the warp rooms. There aren't just 3 for the whole game. There's just 3 for almost the entire game. There's actually 5 total. Anyway, so I was going to say, so there's the machine tower on the left, the chapel tower on the right, and then right in the middle you have the observation tower. Which is kind of a funny name for it. Like, castles don't need a single observation tower, because all of the upper parts of the castle are for observation. It's not really a function you associate with a whole big part of the castle. But oh well. What it really looks like is that it would be some kind of dungeon or keep, you know, to hold prisoners. A lot of people forget that was the main point of the castle for a long time. It was just to be secure. You know, you could hide there when you were fighting a war. Or you could keep prisoners there, and it would be a way to keep them from being rescued. But yeah, this is a pretty neat looking room. You don't get an unobstructed view of the moon as well in this room as you do in the other one, which is why I don't like it as much. But I do like the style of these external battlements areas. They're some of my favorite parts of the game. So there's some legions in here, but in addition, there is a fallen angel, which I think is the most powerful version of the Lilith. But also here, and this is probably the reason that we have a warp room near here, is the battle arena. This is the first battle arena in Castlevania history, and also probably the strangest. So you get to pick your sub-weapon here. There's all of them, so you can pick and choose. The one that you already have, of course, will just be a heart. And I'll let the game itself explain it. So yeah, you cannot use the dual setup system in the arena, which is a crutch that you probably didn't even realize you were leaning on until you come here. Not getting to use DSS here is tough. So let's check it out. Here's the first room, already fairly punishing. We've got a were-jaguar here and a werewolf. You may have also noticed something else which is very jarring and disturbing. There is no music in the entire battle arena. It's bizarre. It just doesn't feel right. Playing this game without music, it almost feels like this turned into some kind of weird old-fashioned PC game or something. Or like something didn't load, is what it feels like. I do not like the battle arena in this game. Not only is it very bizarre, and possibly the most broken and unbalanced part of an already very broken and unbalanced game, but in addition, just playing through it is not that fun, because of the lack of music and just the brutality of it. I don't know why they wouldn't let you use DSS here, I suppose because it's supposed to test your mettle in fighting normal combat. But the thing is, this game's enemies were not designed to be fought with normal combat. They were designed with that crutch of the DSS system in mind. So the idea of a whole giant area, and this area is actually pretty big. I think there's like 10 rooms to this place. A whole big area where you cannot use DSS. It's just kind of awful. We did get some soldier fatigues in here, which is a pretty good like endgame armor item. So I'm not too upset. But despite not being upset, I'm also not going to keep going. That first 3 rooms was good enough for me. We will be coming back to the battle arena later. I make no promises about me beating it. The battle arena is the toughest thing in the game, and it is also like the grindiest thing in the game. You probably cannot get through the battle arena totally until you've fought like the first 10 or so rooms, like maybe 20 times. You should probably be at like level 50 to tackle the battle arena. It's insane. It is even harder, like actually much harder, to get through the arena than it is to beat the final version of Dracula, which you'll soon see when we get to the finale. That's so frickin' difficult that the fact that the battle arena is harder is just, it's wrong. Like, they shouldn't have done that. So here we see the upgraded version of the werehorses, the Minotaurs. Very annoying enemies and very difficult, because not only do they have that big sweep, which comes out suddenly, but it has this shockwave effect, which is almost impossible to get away from if you're anywhere near them. Basically, the only good way to deal with these guys is with a sub-weapon. I would say either the Holy Water or the Cross. As per usual in so many parts of this game, there's pretty much no reason not to have the Cross. One big thing I don't like about this game, which I think does get in the way of it, is that the sub-weapons are so unbalanced. Like, there's almost no reason not to have the Cross as soon as you can get it. Oh, we actually get a pretty nice healing item, spiced meat. By pretty nice, I of course mean it heals like 1/8 of our health. So, you know, we've been dealing with stuff so far that's like 1/30th of our health. So that's quite an upgrade. The best healing item in this game, which we're actually going to get a few of in this episode, is called a Potion High. I don't know why it's not called a High Potion. Just Japanese people being weird, I guess. But those heal 250 HP, which means, of course, it's about 1/3 of the health bar. Not actually bad. By the time we get 3 of those, we'll be able to heal almost an entire health bar. Which, given normal healing in this game, like, that's incredible. We have some kind of fun enemies in this room. I love the Dullahands. They're similar to the Dead Warriors in other games. But yeah, they're just horsemen that ride around on half a horse with the skeleton hanging out. Ooh, there's some nice armor. But unfortunately, it does lower our strength and our luck. Guess I'm not that much of a chicken. Kind of interesting enemy here. One of the more interesting enemies in any game where it appears. The Alraunes, or Allura Une. Allura Une, by the way, is probably a mistranslation. In this game, they actually have it correctly, as Alraune, which is the name of a character from a book. A really weird book about, like, a plant woman who's created by mad science. And it's very Freudian and, like, bizarrely sexual and inappropriate, not safe for YouTube. But the interesting thing about Alraunes is that is actually just the German word for Mandragora, which is not just a mythological thing. Like, Mandragoras is a term that appears in the Bible. It's a plant with some very powerful associations. But yeah, the Alraunes appears as a beautiful woman in this because Mandragoras were supposed to be able to be used to make love potions. And yeah, in this game, actually, oddly enough for a game where so many enemies are really cheap and difficult, Alraunes in this game are among the easier incarnations of that enemy, because once the woman comes out of the flower petals, if you can hit her, you do a lot more damage than if you just hit the petals. And it's pretty easy to get rid of them once that's exposed. So, you know, good on you, Koji Horie. This is one case where you decided to be fair, and I appreciate it. I will say, and I don't know if this was intentional, I recently watched a movie called Deep Red, or Profundo Rosso, by Dario Argento, and this does look kind of like the room at the beginning of that story, where a psychic detects that there's a serial killer in the audience. And then, of course, 5 minutes later she gets killed by the same serial killer in order to protect the killer's identity. Speaking of getting killed, here we have probably the hardest regular enemy in the game that you see more than one of, the Dark Armors. These guys attack pretty much 4 times in a row, and they can, sort of based on where you were last time you dodged one of their attacks, they can attack, you know, up, middle, or down. One thing that makes these guys a little easier to fight is remembering that as long as they're attacking either middle or up, you can duck in front of them and keep hitting them, and they'll never hit you unless they point down. Now, of course, if you stay below them for too long, they will definitely start pointing down, and then you have to start worrying about it. The other thing about these, I'm looking for a save room here, and I really thought there was going to be one, but it turns out there's no save room in this part of the level, because why would there be? We also have here who is definitely the hardest non-boss enemy in the whole game that there is only one of, and that is the Devil. As his name suggests, he's tough. So this guy can teleport all over the room, he has lots of different attacks that cover a huge portion of the screen and do all kinds of damage. I actually killed him there, but I didn't realize it. I thought he teleported away, but he actually did die. Yeah, be careful when you're fighting the Devil. I mean, that's just good advice for life, but in this game particularly. Boy, there's something we couldn't use ever. It's interesting, I like that little tower in the background, but the funny thing about that is, well, not only are there, like, clearly more than one of them, which is nuts, like, there must be castles all over this frickin' country, but also, that's clearly not the castle we're in. Right? Because the one we're in is fairly linear. It's laid out. You can see where the different rooms are. Unless there's some kind of weird orientation thing going on here, where like we're looking east and west rather than north and south. And so we're actually looking at the machine tower, maybe? I don't think that's what's happening. I think just they thought that the castle in the background was a cool touch, and so they duplicated it in order to save on graphic space. But the result of that is it feels like we're in this one castle, and there's like 8 more castles in the surrounding vicinity. Which, who knows? Maybe that actually is part of the lore, because this game is so weird. Maybe Camilla deliberately chose a place where there'd be lots of castles, so in case she failed to bring Dracula back in one of them, she could just move on to another one. So yeah, I did a lot of grinding in order to get, health stuff back and more hearts. So now we are ready. Let's fight the master of the castle. Oh, hey, Hugh. Yep. Oh, nice to see you too, Hugh. In what universe, Hugh, are you superior to me? So yeah, I love how Hugh's like, you're being controlled by Camilla, and then it's like, oh no, wait, Camilla's dead. I literally just killed her. So it's Dracula. Must be. So this is Hugh. He's a vampire killer like you. He has some really cool moves. And I have to say, this is a great fight. This is like one of my favorite fights. Well, this is my favorite fight in the entire game, and one of my favorite fights in the series. A lot of the Igavanias do have a fight like this where you fight a vampire killer like yourself, or someone who's at least human and sort of attacks in a human way. So you have Max and Kishin in Harmony of Dissonance. You have Julius in Aria of Sorrow, which, sorry, Circle of the Moon, that is better than this. But I will say for this game, only a little. Hugh has a nice mix of attacks. I like that you can throw him off his, rhythm by attacking him. And, he keeps you on your toes and you keep him on his toes. I also like how, once you attack him enough, he gets, really enraged and he starts using more powerful versions of his vampire killer tools. He has all the same as you, right? So he has holy water, but, it's been cursed to be, unholy water. He has his swords. He has the crosses, just like you, although I use my crosses better. Throwing out tons of knives, like Dio. But the one thing about this fight is, even though I do like it, I do kind of cheese this fight, and I'm not sorry for that, which you can easily do by just running back and forth. If you stay out of the range of most of Hugh's attacks, there's not much he can do to you. He can hit you with his more wide-range attacks, but those don't tend to do a lot of damage, like his knives. They're piddling. So really, Hugh is kind of easy when you treat him like this, which is good, because Hugh's pathetic, and I want to beat him without much trouble. You're back to being just a normal asshole. Those fears were well-founded, Hugh. Enough. I love it. Nathan is being like, no, don't badmouth yourself, but in the back of my head, I'm like, Nathan just doesn't want to hear you talk anymore. He's sick of that crap. Nathan's like, Hugh, you say this every day. Can we get past this, please? I accept. That's right, Hugh. We'll do what you could not do. I didn't mean for that to rhyme, but it did. I do that a lot. And now we get the last key. This takes us to the room where Dracula is, and Morris, our master. So I'm feeling pretty good. After that really difficult area, we now have, we've beaten Hugh, we've proven our superiority, and now we're going to fight Dracula. Things are good. So, to celebrate it, I have Nathan rock out a little bit to Vampire Killer. And look who's here. It's our good old friend the Mouse Pointer dancing with us. I tried to do a little waltz thing here. Oh, this is so dumb. Good evening. It's time to do what we've been waiting to do this entire game. No, just kidding. Actually, what we're going to do is go through that door. We just got the master key last time from Hugh, and now it's time to face down Dracula in his den. The ceremonial room, which has got kind of an interesting design to it, but I'm a little bit disappointed they chose to use the Sinking Sanctuary music here, when they could have, done something really, ominous. And in fact, it would have been better for that to be one room where there's no music. That actually would have made more sense. But oh well. So I actually really like this aspect of the story, that Dracula appeals to you through your sense of egotism. That actually does relate to something in the original book Dracula that's done by a guy named Renfield, who has this whole theory about, certain organisms being superior to others, with humanity being at the top, but of course Dracula being a vampire is one step above humanity, and that's why Renfield worships him. kind of just a cool thing for them to include in this game. And I do like how this game does try to do some interesting, clever things with the story of Dracula. This fight, on the other hand, is not a particularly clever thing to do with Dracula. This is very similar to other fights that have been with Dracula in the past. It's also, I have to say, pretty easy. But don't let this fool you, this is just the first stage of the fight. And it gets a lot worse from here. Yeah, that musical track there, I have to say, is a good example of, I don't know, like what's called a wasted track on TV tropes. Because it's a pretty cool song, and you are probably going to hear it for at most a minute and a half, unless you're really underleveled. But oh well, that's what sound tests are for. Nice to see you, Hugh. Yep, so it's time. We're going to actually face down Dracula at his full power and defeat him. This is no time to get scared. I'm just kidding. This is us we're talking about. It's chicken time. But no, I'm at level 45. I've got almost 900 HP, almost 900 MP. I got a lot of hearts. I got some good armor. So either the Rainbow Robe or the Soldier's Fatigues are pretty good for this. I think considering that I do physical attacks a lot more often, the Soldier Fatigues would have been a smarter choice. But for some reason, I left the Rainbow Robe on quite a lot through this. It doesn't make a huge difference, as we'll soon see. And then I have the Strength Ring and the Star Bracelet. For healing items, I have 3 High Potions, 7 Antidotes, Cure Curse, it doesn't matter, 2 Mind Restores, 2 Mind Highs, and the ability to recover about 100 hearts. And that's going to have to do. We're going to have to defeat Dracula's second stage, or more properly, his second and third stages, because he doesn't have just one final form. And here it is. So this is Dracula. This is basically the true Dracula at his full power. I don't know why he looks like this. Like, he looks very much like some weird Japanese comic book character. He almost looks like an X-Men character or something. Like, he's very over-designed. But oh well. He has several different attacks, all of which are a little bit cheap, and some of which are ludicrously cheap. This Meteor Shower, to me, is the worst one of all of them. I absolutely hate it. It's almost impossible to work out a way that you won't get hit by the meteors. Now, it is possible to not get hit by them, but only if you're lucky. I don't know of a way to carefully avoid it. This laser attack, where he sets the floor on fire, on the other hand, is pretty easy to avoid. And actually, you don't need to do what I'm doing, which is just jump in the air the whole time, but that is the easiest way to avoid it. There's another way which allows you to actually hit him, and so that's a little bit better. We also saw right at the beginning, of course, that attack where he sends out a bunch of poison clouds. And yes, these are poison clouds, so maybe I shouldn't have said antidotes aren't important, because they are. He can poison you in this. I don't think he can curse you. At the very least, I never got cursed in any of these. Be careful of those little clouds of bubbles, because they can move in kind of an erratic way if you let them get out of control. But it is important to remember that you can destroy them by using either a sub-weapon or your whip. Also important to remember they will briefly stay on screen after he transitions to a new phase. Speaking of transitioning to a new phase, we have now done enough damage, which you can tell from him flashing in that multicolored way, that he is now going to phase 3. What you actually need to do is, as soon as you hear that little cue, the wheep thing, you need to jump up into the air using the rock wing. He will partially track you, so just jumping a little bit is not enough to avoid him. He'll move up in order to intercept you. Now, you might wonder, where is Dracula now, right? He was just zooming across the screen. When he stops doing that, which he does sort of a random number of zooms across the screen for each one of those phases, he will then turn into this eyeball with a bunch of bats around it, like this bat cloud. If you think that means he's easy, he's just an eyeball with these bats, don't. This is actually the hardest attack he does in the entire game. He moves very quickly and into the air a lot. Plus, there's lots of these bats. Like, you might expect 5 or 6 bats would be enough to protect him in this. No, he has a cloud of like 15 of them. And they can all take hits for him. And they all do a fair amount of damage. When you hit one of those bats, you'll take like 80 damage each. Plus, these guys will hit you again and again, because you're trying to hit Dracula. He has a surprising amount of health in this phase. You might think, once you've like gotten down the proper big Dracula and he turns into an eyeball, that he wouldn't have much health. You'd be wrong. This eyeball has quite a bit of health. I think it actually has more health than he did in the first phase. Which is pretty unfair, just like everything else in this game that is unfair. So the thing about that part of the boss fight where he turns into the eyeball with the bats, is that you're trying to hit him, and he moves so strangely. he can move totally out of the range of your ability to jump. You might notice there's only those 2 platforms. If this boss fight were more fair, then they'd have lots of platforms and you could chase him around. Instead, they kind of make it so that you have to use the rock wing to jump up into the air. The problem with that being you have very little control over that giant jump. And if you do that when you don't know where he is above you, you could jump right into the cloud of bats and just get hit. It is almost impossible to do what it seems like the game intends for you to do, which is use the rock wing to leap into the air and then attack him while you've just leapt into the air. So, in other words, what the game is asking you to do is something you cannot do. You have to just wait around like a chump on the floor for him to come close to you and then start using your attacks against him. And that's just so dispiriting. And I launch myself right into him and die again. And again. And again. 5 times I fought this guy and died every single time. So, obviously I am doing something wrong. I mentioned before this game's kind of like Demon's Souls. One way it is like that is that I was simply unable to defeat the final boss using conventional methods. What I ended up doing was resorting to cheesing the game, using one of its many abilities to basically make this boss fight a joke, but not entirely. What this strategy entails is going to get the Uranus card, which comes from an enemy called the Scary Candle, which I won't get too much into how to get him, except that you can look it up if you're interested. But the Uranus card allows you to do summons, which will attack everything on screen for a fair amount of damage. I also go back to another enemy and get the Thunderbird card, because the Thunderbird summon is the best one to use against Dracula. And using that, I'm finally able to even the odds and to do a decent job against the second phase of this boss fight. It is funny to me how the first stage of Dracula is so rich with different types of attacks, when you'll have this tendency to beat him very quickly in it, so he might not even use all of his attacks before you get him into the next stage. Then in the next stage he just has 2 attacks that he alternates constantly, and the second one can barely be called an attack. He just turns into an eyeball with a bunch of bats and faffs around. Like, this is one of the reasons I really hate this stage of the boss fight and the boss fight overall. It's not just that this boss fight is too hard, it's that it's boring. This is a really boring attack. Maybe the most boring attack that a version of Dracula has ever had. And that's just, if you're gonna fight an eyeball surrounded by bats, they could at least make it more interesting than this. But you'll notice I'm doing a lot better with these Thunderbird summons now. At some point, even though this can be a little nerve-wracking, the part where you're just using the rock swing to jump into the air is almost zen-like. It can be very peaceful. And then you get to this stage of the fight, which is the opposite of that. I don't know why that suddenly started doing less damage. But, yeah, he's dead. That killed Dracula. I think I got 4 Thunderbird summons off, and that was enough. It all just depends on how long the eyeball stays on screen to get hit by the Thunderbird. What a nutty boss fight. Yeah, stay down, Dracula. You're a bad boss fight, and you should feel bad. Mankind ill needs a savior such as you. I love Nathan's turn of phrase. You can bet on that, Dracula. Believe it. Nathan is probably an underrated Castlevania protagonist, I have to say. He's got a lot of personality to him. He's certainly much better than Juiced Belmont. Although, if you could play as Maxim Kishin would probably be the best. How are you feeling, Master? Did you have a good nap? While you were having your innards sucked out by Dracula? Yeah, Hugh gets busted down to buck private because of his horrible actions. He'll need to learn to use commas in his sentences. Oh, Hugh. That's never going to happen. Ho, 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 ho. So, this has been Castlevania Circle of the Moon, guys. When I first saw, after beating this, that the producer of this game was Koji, I did assume that was Koji Igarashi. I should have known that he wasn't, because Igarashi calls himself Iga in all of the games that he's worked on. Koji is actually Koji Horie, who was the same first name, but, a totally different guy and totally different approach. So yeah, this game is so weird. If I had to sum it up, I would say, on the one hand, I love this game. It's really creative, it's unique, and the fact that it's willing to be a little bit broken gives it an appeal that the other Castlevania games do not have, at least not the other Metroidvanias. On the other hand, this game. This game is so mean. It is the most mean-spirited, cruel, and brutal Castlevania game I've ever played, to the point that it sometimes seriously demoralized me and made me not want to keep playing. I am fairly certain, looking back on it, that the first time I played this game, I did not beat it, because of how hard it was. I got to Dracula, and I just could not get past it. Don't mind my potato of a computer acting up again. So this is actually the first time I've ever beaten Castlevania Circle of the Moon, and I have to say, it feels pretty damn triumphant. One nice thing about this game is that because it's so cruel, the catharsis of beating this game is immense. If you've played other Metroidvanias, and your feeling is just they're too soft, they're too easy, and you want a tougher, meatier challenge, this game is it. Rather than recommending you play, like the older Castlevania games, I would recommend you play this. This has some of the appeal of the other Metroidvania games, but it has much more difficulty. And it has its own little charms. I love Nathan as a protagonist, I love Hugh as a rival, and Camilla as an antagonist is, kind of okay. So for all those reasons, I would say this is a game well worth playing. That's why I made a Let's Play of it.